Most international trade disputes and unnecessary costs start with the simple misunderstandings of Incoterms. In this webinar, you discover how the right Incoterm can protect your business, streamline your contracts, and save you money. Are you ready to take control of your global transactions? Let's get started. Hi, my name is Suman Jibril. I am the licensed customs broker and the CEO of Phoenix Global Shipping, and I do monthly webinars to educate people on the trade world. And today's topic is Incoterms Explained. What are Incoterms? Incoterms are international trade terms and conditions. There are three letter codes like CFR, FOB, FAS, which we'll get through in this webinar. So they define who pays the freight at each stage of cargo delivery, who's responsible at the cargo at each stage, why are they important. They clarify payments and responsibility between seller and buyers. They help avoid disputes by providing clear rules for international trade. They are used in contracts to specify costs and risk transfer points. So we're going to discuss the vessel, sea, and inland waterway general application. Key terms. What are qualifiers? Qualifier is a label or code that precisely identifies the location or point where the transfer of goods or risk or responsibility happens. It ensures both parties know exactly where obligation changes hands, reducing confusion and disputes in international shipping. What is risk transfer? It is the exact point when the buyer becomes responsible for any loss or damage to the goods as defined by the chosen Incoterm. What is freight? It is the shipment of goods, bulk, and Incoterms that identifies who pays for the main shipping leg, from where to where responsibility for those costs apply. So the general application for FAS. FAS is free alongside ship. FAS is an Incoterm used in international trade, specifically for sea and inland waterway transport. So the seller delivers good alongside the ship, clear for export, and they load it into the vessel, and it becomes the buyer responsibility. Qualifier, the port of loading. Risk of transfer at the port, cargo lading on board. In other words, risk transfer to the buyer when goods are placed alongside the vessel at the port. Freight collects from delivery point. Best use of FAS if you have bulky, non-containerized goods like heavy machinery vehicles. Documents required is the bill of lading and packing list. So summary, FAS seller delivers goods alongside the vessel, risk transfers before loading, and buyers handles the loading. General application for FOB. Free on board. Seller is responsible for delivering the goods on board the vessel nominated by the buyer at the named port of shipment and clears the goods for export. Point of risk of transfer. Risk and cost transfer to the buyer once the goods are loaded onto the vessel. The seller pays for all costs up to and including loading the goods onto the ship, including export duties, taxes, and customs clearance. Buyer, they assume all risks and costs from the moment of goods are on board, including main carriage, freight, insurance, and unloading at the destination, and import duties. The best use for this is used for containerized cargo and when the seller can arrange loading at the port. It's not suitable if the seller cannot arrange loading or if the goods are not delivered directly to the vessel. Summary, FOB is seller delivers and loads goods onto the vessel, risk transfers at loading. CFR, cost and freight. So the seller is responsible for delivering the goods on board the vessel at the port of shipment and pays the freight to transport the goods to the named port of destination. Risk is transferred to the buyer once the goods are loaded onto the vessel at the port of shipment, not when they arrive at the destination port. Important distinction. The seller is not required to provide insurance for the goods during transit. The buyer must arrange and pay for any insurance coverage if desired. The buyer is responsible for unloading, import duties, and at all costs and risk after the goods are on board the vessel, commonly used for bulk commodities and sea or inland waterway transport. This is when the buyer needs a customs broker, which you can reach out to Phoenix Global Shipping for. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. So the seller is responsible for delivering goods on board the vessel at the port of shipment, pays for the freight to the named port of destination, and must also procure and pay for marine insurance covering the buyer's risk of loss or damage during the transit. Risk transfer to the buyer once the goods are loaded onto the vessel at the port of shipment, the same as CFR. The insurance is provided by the seller is typically minimum coverage, like Institute Cargo Clause, The buyer may purchase additional insurance if needed. The buyer is responsible for unloading, import duties, and all costs and risks of the goods are on board the vessel, but benefits from insurance coverage arranged by the seller. Also used exclusively for sea or inland waterway transport. Break bulk, non-containerized cargo. So break bulk cargo refers to goods that are loaded, transported, and unloaded individually rather than container or bulk tanks. These items are typically too large, heavy, or irregularly shaped for standard containers and are handled piece by piece, often using cranes or other specialized equipments. Example includes machinery, steel, girders, vehicles, and construction equipment. Break bulk cargo is usually packed in crates, drums, pallets, or left as it is and is loaded directly onto the vessel's deck or hold. What is LCL versus FCL? Less than container load versus full container load. LCL is multiple shippers share space in a single container. You pay only for the space you use, making it cost effective for small shipment. LCL involves more handling, which can increase risk and Transit time. Best for shipment under 15 cubic meters or few pallets. Full container load. Once shipper uses the entire container, which is sealed at origin and opened at destination, this method is faster, more secure, and cost effective for a large 15 to 20 cubic meter or more. Ro-ro, roll on, roll off. Ro-ro shipping is used for cargo that can be driven or rolled on and off a vessel, such as cars, trucks, buses, and heavy machinery. Ro-ro vessels have built-in ramps, allowing vehicles to be loaded and unloaded quickly and safely. It reduces the risk of damage compared to lifting with cranes. Ro-ro is ideal for wheeled or self-propelled cargo and is widely used in automotive and heavy equipment industries. BOL versus BL, bill of lading. Bill of lading, or BL as abbreviated for the same critical shipping documents. Bill of lading, a contract between the shipper and a carrier, a receipt for the goods and documents of title. It can be negotiable, ownership, transferable, or non-negotiable straight bill of lading where goods go directly to the named consignee. BOL and BL are used interchangeably, though BL is more common in maritime shipping. LTL versus TL, less than truckload versus truckload. LTL, multiple shippers share space on a truck, used for shipments under 15,000 pounds or fewer than 6 pallets, cost effective, but may involve larger transit time due to multiple stops. TL, truckload, a single shipper uses the entire truck, typically for shipments over 15,000 pounds or up to 26 pallets. Faster and more secure, but more expensive. EEI, electronic export information. EEI is electronic export filing of exporting data required by US regulations for shipments valued over 2,500 per Schedule B number or those requiring an export license. It is submitted through the automated export system, AES, and it is mandatory for most export except to Canada and certain US territory. The EEI provides export statistics and ensures compliance with US export laws. So, for example, with EEI, what it mentions with data, let's say you're in the United States, even if you're in the US, it could still be considered an export. I'll do another video about it. But let's say you have a US technology and you have a Russian employees that works in California and you have a company here in Virginia and that you want to share it with that, Russian citizen. That is considered an export. So if based on the proprietary information, that specific technology might require you to have an export license. So people don't think just because a person or entities in the United States is not an export, it is still considered an export. Let's move on. So this is just the breakdown of table of who is responsible for what. So for example, for prep for transport, mark and label. For FAS is the seller. For FOB is the seller. For CFR is the seller. For CIF is the seller. For block and brace, it's the buyer. For FAS, FOB buyer, CFR buyer, CIF buyer. Export clearance licenses, EEI, AES. The seller is responsible for FAS. The FOB, the seller. The CFR, the seller. The CIF, the seller is responsible. Arrange insurance. None of them are responsible for FAS, FOB, CFR, or CIF. Select a carrier. The buyer is responsible for FAS and for FOB. The seller is responsible for the CFR and CIF. Selecting freight forwarder. The buyer is responsible for the FAS and FOB. The seller is responsible for the CFR and CIF. The pay origin terminal charges. The buyer is responsible for FAS, but the seller is responsible for FOB, CFR, and CIF. Arrange and pay main carriage. The buyer is responsible for FAS and FOB for doing this. The seller is responsible for CFR and CIF. Load main carriage. The buyer is responsible for doing that for the FAS, but the seller is responsible for the FOB, CFR, and CIF. And then stowing and unloading main carriage. The buyer is responsible for that for the FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. Paying destination terminal charges. The buyer is responsible for FAS and FOB, and neither of them are responsible for CFR and CIF. Arrange and pay on carriage. Buyer is responsible for all four: FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF. Arrange and pay import clearance. The buyer is responsible for all of them: FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF. Pay duties and taxes and fees. Again, the buyer is responsible for all of that. Delivery to buyer destination and unload from on carriage. Also the buyer responsibility for all of them: FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF. Now we're going to go to the all modes of transportation. Ex-works. Ex-work means seller places shipment at the disposal of the buyer at the seller's facility. The seller is not responsible for the loadings buyer carrier. Export clearance is the buyer's responsibility. The qualifiers is that it's the seller's facility. Risk transfers at the seller's premises. Freight is collected from the XW point. So this all transportation is like anything that's not sea. Like for everything, this applies for all other transportation methods, for all modes of transportation. FCA, free carrier. Seller delivers shipments to the buyer selected carrier at the specified F geographic location. So seller loads the first carrier. The qualifiers: FCA seller facility, the forwarder's warehouse, seller's country airport, or steamship terminal, seller's country. Risk transferred, name place of delivery, freight is collected from the delivery point at the specified location. CBT, carriage paid to, CIP, carriage and insurance paid to. Seller arranges transport to the specified delivery point of place or port or place. CIB requires the seller to obtain minimum insurance coverage. Seller fulfills delivery obligation upon delivery to the carrier. The qualifiers: CBT or CIP, destination airport, destination terminal, or buyer's destination. Risk transfer at point cargo delivered to carrier. Freight paid by seller to destination port or place. What is DAB? Delivered at place. DPU, delivered at place unloaded. DDP, delivered duty paid. Seller arranges and delivers to the destination place. DAP, delivered at place. DPU, delivered at place unloaded. DDP, delivered duty paid. Qualifiers: FCA seller facility, the DBU, DAB, DDP destination airport, terminal, or buyer's destination. Risk transferred, named place of delivery, freight prepaid by seller to destination port or place. Buyer seller responsibility. So to export pack is the seller's responsibility on all of them for XW, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDB. Again, the same thing for marking a label, seller responsibility. For the block and brace, buyer responsibility for all of them. Export clearance and license, buyer for XW, FCA, CBT, and CIB, but for export clearance for DAP, DPU, DDP, it's the seller's responsibility. Arrange insurance for XW, FCA, and CBT. Neither of them have to arrange it, but if it's for CIP, then the seller has to arrange it. If it's DAP, neither of them. If it's DPU, neither. If it's DDP, neither. So the only time arrange insurance is if it's CIP. Select carrier. The buyer arranges the carrier to select it at XW, EXW, and FCA. Then for CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDP, the seller is responsible for selecting a carrier. Selecting freight forwarder, the buyer is responsible for EXW and FCA, and then for all others, the seller is responsible. Arrange and pay for pre-carriage, the buyer is responsible for EXW and FCA. The seller is responsible for CBT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. Pay origin terminal charges, the buyer is responsible for that. And for EXW and FCA, and then for CBT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDP, the seller is responsible. So we did arrange a main pay carriage, which is the buyer, and then everything else the seller, and then load main carriage, the buyer for the EXW, everything else the FCA, CBT, CIP, the seller is responsible loading the main carriage, and then for the DAP, DPU, DDP, neither of them are responsible. So make sure to take a picture of this just so you have it for you. Pay destination terminal charges, the buyer is responsible for EXW and FCA. And then for CPT and CIP and DAP, neither of them are responsible, but for DPU and DDP, the seller is responsible. Arrange and pay on carriage, the buyer is responsible for EXW, FCA, CPT, CIB, DAP, and then for DPU and DDP, the seller is responsible. Arrange and pay import clearance, the buyer is responsible for all of them except for the DDP, the seller pays for that. Pays duties and taxes and fees. The buyer is responsible for all of them except the DDP. The seller pays for duties, taxes, and fees when it comes to DDP. Unload from on carriage. The buyer is responsible for EXW, FCA, CPT, CIB, DAP, DDP, except DPU. The seller is responsible for that. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. My name is Sumaya Jabril, and I'm a licensed customs broker with Phoenix Global Shipping. If you have any questions, please give us a call, send us an email, and thank you again for attending our webinars. Have a great day.